All right, let's take a look at the welfare effects of price controls, right? So we've seen price controls before, price floors, pushing the price above equilibrium, setting that minimum, a price ceiling, setting a maximum price, pushing it below equilibrium. And we talked about how those would lead to a surplus and a shortage, respectively. But now that we have the tools of welfare analysis, consumer surplus, producer surplus, total surplus, deadweight loss, now we can really start to quantify the impacts of these disequilibrium results. So let's look at the price floor scenario with the classic example of a minimum wage. So we've got our diagram here, and as before, right, we've got an equilibrium, W star being the equilibrium wage, and the thought process. Policymakers decide that wage is too low, right? We want to have somebody working a 40-hour week to make a living wage, a living income to support a family. And suppose that equilibrium wage is $7, $8 an hour in most urban environments. That's not going to be a living wage, right? So policymakers say, okay, let's by law force firms to offer a higher wage, whatever that may be. Kind of the going thought process there is $15 an hour. And as we saw, right, as we push the price above equilibrium, it's going to have two effects, right? The law of supply, quantity supplied is going to go up, meaning more workers are going to be willing to work. So that supply curve, remember, is on the part of workers. But firms are going to hit the law of demand, charge a higher price. They're going to buy fewer units, and the number of workers hired is going to be decreasing. So that's going to lead, of course, to our quantity supplied being greater than quantity demanded, and our unemployment, right, as that gap between the number of workers who are willing to work and the number of jobs available. So that's kind of where we left this topic previously. Well, now you've noticed we've also divvied up that area between supply and demand into these areas A, B, C, D, and E, which are going to represent consumer and producer surplus before and after the policy. So think about what's happening at equilibrium. Wage W star, quantity of labor Q star. Right? It's, as we've defined it up to this point, consumer surplus. And remember, who's getting the consumer surplus? The buyers, the consumers of labor. This is the firms, right? Benefits from the low skill labor market. That's going to be this entire triangle up here, areas A, B, and D. Right? So as always, the area under the demand curve, above the price, out to the quantity, that's going to be our consumer surplus. The producer surplus, now on the part of workers, those supplying labor, is going to be the entire area under the price, above the supply curve, out to the quantity. So that's going to be areas C and E. So that's kind of the initial starting point. At equilibrium, consumer surplus, A, B, and D, producer surplus, C and E. So once the minimum wage, the price floor, is put into place, right, what's going to be driving the welfare effects is going to be the change in quantity, right? So now, unambiguously, right, consumers of labor are going to lose. They're going to have to pay more for their workers, and they're going to be hiring less. So the new consumer surplus is going to be just area A, right, because the price went up and the quantity went down. So it's the area under the demand curve, above the price, out to the quantity. So that's the new consumer surplus. The producer surplus is a little bit more complicated, right? Because some are winning and some are losing, right? The area under the price goes all the way up here and includes area B, but it's truncated, right? It only goes out to the quantity QD above the supply curve. So in the policy, after the policy is imposed, our consumer surplus, that is shrunk from A, B, and D just to area A. Producer surplus has done a little bit of a swap. It's gained area B, but lost area E. Right? So this is a little bit ambiguous. What is unambiguous, the second unambiguous result, in addition to consumer surplus decreasing, is that there is a deadweight loss, right? These areas D and E used to be part of consumer and producer surplus, respectively. Now they're not, right? So that is the very definition of a deadweight loss. It's lost gains from trade that aren't transferred to anybody else. Right? Area B is not a deadweight loss. It is a loss to the consumers, but it pops back up as part of producer surplus, right? So area B is a transfer, not a social loss. It's a loss to consumers, but it's a gain to producers. D and E is a net social loss. So what we should be able to do, right, kind of track consumer and producer surplus and deadweight loss in the aftermath of a disequilibrium policy like this. So to get back to the question, kind of from a policy standpoint, is this a good idea? Okay, we understand there is going to be a social cost to the policy, but remember the point of a minimum wage policy is to benefit the workers. Are they actually going to come out ahead as a result of this policy? Well, just kind of, again, track it down. It depends on who you ask, right? For those that are still employed, right, that are one of the QD job holders, well, this is fantastic, right? They're willing to work, say, just pick a point here. This guy's willing to work, willing to sell labor for this price. And he used to earn this wage, and that gap would be their surplus, their net gain. Well, now they still have a job and they're earning this much more. So that area B is the unambiguous gain to those that are still employed after the policy. But that's partially balanced, right, from those that used to have gains in area E, but are no longer employed. So the only way that this has a net positive effect on workers as a whole is if area B, the gain to those who keep their jobs, outweighs area E, the loss to those that are losing their jobs. So now we have to think about under what circumstances would area B, the gains, be larger or small? Well, what's driving this, of course, is how sensitive firms are to raising wages. And we have a way to measure that, right? That's just elasticity, right? So when the price goes up, how many fewer units does a consumer purchase? The more elastic the demand is, the bigger the reaction. So ultimately, the question about what is the impact, what is the net effect of a policy like this going to be, is a question about elasticity, right? So because the losses occur due to the change in quantity, a more elastic labor demand curve, firms more sensitive to wage when deciding how many workers to hire, the more elastic that demand curve is, the bigger the reaction, the more job losses are going to occur, the bigger the deadweight loss is going to be, and the bigger that area E is going to be relative to area B, the less beneficial this policy will be. Okay. So if you ever find yourself at a party arguing about minimum wage and whether it's a good policy or a bad policy, you can't really come to a conclusion until you've established what the elasticity of labor demand is. If you believe that that labor demand is highly elastic, you're basically saying this is not a good idea, right? Raising the wage is going to force firms to fire a lot of people, right? And the argument, right, as with any elasticity, it's all about substitutability. So if you believe firms can replace labor with, say, capital and technology, then this would be a bad policy. If you believe labor demand is highly inelastic, then you'd say, well, as we raise the wage above equilibrium, firms are not going to lose that many workers. They're not going to fire that many workers. They don't have a lot of substitutes. And it kind of depends on which industry you're talking about, right? So just to nail this down, let's redraw this diagram with a more inelastic demand for labor, just to show the result, right? So clearly what's happening, right, is the distance here, the vertical distance is the same. So we're imposing the same policy, the same raise in the wage above equilibrium. But because of that steep demand curve, that inelastic nature of demand, the way we've sketched it out, it's a much smaller drop in quantity. So this area where deadweight loss occurs, that triangle right between the old quantity and the new quantity, is going to be a lot smaller. And area B, you will notice, is a lot wider. More people keep their jobs and experience the benefit of earning a higher wage. So in this case, area E is a lot smaller, area B is a lot bigger, and there's going to be a net gain to the workers as a result of this policy. There's still a net social welfare loss, but it's going to be a lot smaller, and the aim of the policy is much more likely to be met, benefiting low-skill workers. So this will be the case no matter what type of policy we're looking at. We'll look at it again with a price ceiling. Same thing's going to occur with taxes and subsidies. The impact on quantity is going to be driving the degree of welfare loss that occurs. And what determines the reaction of quantity to a change in price? It's elasticity. That's always what it's going to come down to. I think the labor market and minimum wage is a nice example to kind of set this off, because it's something we can all relate to, right? And it's an argument that comes up a lot. So the good news is, no matter what scenario you're looking at, it's always going to look very similar to this, right? It's always going to be that supply and demand area broken down into grids of rectangles and triangles. And as long as we can identify consumer surplus, producer surplus, deadweight loss, right, before and after a policy, what's being transferred from one side to the other, that's what's going to tell the story of the welfare effects of these types of policies. So we'll pick this back up with the price ceiling below equilibrium, and then the more complicated, but also much richer story of taxation we will look at next. So thank you.